And we're going to be talking a lot about kind of soup to nuts on Blazor. One of the things I wanted to preface this with is, and I have an agenda slide upcoming, but if anybody was anybody at the Blazor pre-con that we did? I see a couple of hands. Just to level set, this is a heavy overlap of some of that. So it will not offend me if there was a competing session that those folks wanted to see or something like that. I just wanted to, but if you wanted to get reiterate on that or kind of drive home a little bit more and maybe some things have lit up, that's perfectly fine as well. I've enjoyed meeting a lot of you here at the conference or having conversations at lunch, but for those that I haven't met, my name's Alan Conway. I'm a principal consultant with Zebia in the Microsoft Services line. I have about almost 25 years of professional experience exclusively in this field, running .NET since its inception and the early days of web forms and things of that nature, and MVC, and then back-end development. Did about a decade of front-end development with heavy in Angular and TypeScript and JavaScript, things of that nature. And of course, that makes me really appreciate Blazor. So hopefully the audience here and what this will cater to today are folks that are new to Blazor, newer to Blazor, maybe coming back, because again, the zero to hero I want to cover with a broad brushstroke and show you so that when you leave the conference, you feel confident, maybe as a decision maker, a contributor, or whatever, to know Blazor as a technology stack and how that works. Just to wrap this one up, there's a bunch of contact information there. If it's Alan Conway, it pretty much you can get a hold of me, other than the YouTube channel, The Eclectic Dev. And so, yeah, you can take that down right there. Speaking of the agenda, we're going to start from, one of the intangibles here is, okay, right, we can get straight to Blazor and we're going to learn about it, but like, what about React or Angular or all those mainstream frameworks or, other decisions? just to talk a little bit about that. And then there's the different templates and rendering modes and things of that nature. But we also need to get into really the core fundamentals and meat and potatoes, which are Blazor components, because things like rendering modes and some of that is, a lot of it's kind of day one and you're picking, and yes, as you build components, you have to make these selections and there is coding involved in it. But when it comes down to creating great applications, great Blazor applications, you're building components. And so we need to talk a lot about how components are made and the structure. And so you feel confident that you can go out and do that. And then we'll talk about why it's so great to be in the ecosystem of C# and .NET with Blazor, right? But we can still use JavaScript if needed. So we can see how we can interop into that, because that world still exists. Maybe you have some existing libraries. Maybe you need to use an open source library from NPM. You're like, I love Blazor, but I need this charting thing or this other deal. No problem. Interop into it, and there's a nice bridge between the two. Also, with I love being in here to see all the folks, but sometimes the lighting. So if anybody has a question, absolutely just holler out. If I can't see your hands, just like, hey, Alan, I have, I'll hear you. Just let me know. I encourage if anybody has any questions on this. So where are we today with the modern web, modern application, especially with the client? Now, this is not a comprehensive list. And, if you turn back the clock 8 to 10 years ago, there was a lot of churn on the front end for modern web development. And here's the deal, just a quick history thing. When it was, 2005, 10, 12, in that area, we needed to code efficiently, write once and deploy everywhere. And the medium for that was the browser and ultimately JavaScript, TypeScript. Not everybody likes that, and it's understood. But it was the way that we were able to do this. And with advancements in the browser and also with the frameworks themselves, we were able to have robust client-side rendering frameworks. And so there was a lot of churn in that community. And there's still a bazillion libraries. That's an official number, by the way. But the forefront, the run, the mainstream, Angular, React, maybe Vue. And so there's heavy adoption, and those have stabilized. A lot of times I get asked the question, hey, do I need to leave Angular or React or Vue to do Blazor? And that is not, there's no direct answer. I'll give you a quick one. Not necessarily. There's nothing. It's not like like in typical modernization paths, like that was before, and this is, now. And so we'll talk about more about maybe some of those trade-offs, but enter in to the modern web client landscape, Blazor.net, WebAssembly, which is independent of Microsoft and this technology stack. The way to create compiled code for the web, really cool, versus, the way JavaScript typically works, interpreted. And so there's some performance efficiencies, and there's some real cool factors to be able to lean on WebAssembly. So that's at the backbone of it. So why not JavaScript? If these frameworks are great, they're tenured, they're working, why would we not want to use that? Well, this was the question again. You're saying like, hey, Alan, we're on, sometimes I'll get folks that'll come up and ask me, let's say, hey, we're on Angular, but we were thinking about Blazor, should we switch? Well, a lot of it has to do about like the DNA of your team. So especially like a conference like this, where the commonality is mostly the Microsoft stack or near to it. Yes, we're open. So, there's all types of other things, but a lot of C# and .NET and things. If that's your expertise at your shop and you have a wealth of knowledge, well, it's like coming back home, because you can use all those patterns and practices that you wanted to use for years. A lot of times in the last 10 years, had clients that kind of begrudgingly had to move to, before Blazor, to one of the other things like Angular React. They're like, oh, we got this old MVC dinosaur, what do we use? Angular React, I guess we got to learn JavaScript or TypeScript. But now the excitement can be, no problem. We can have modern web development by doing the skill set that we know. So if you are a shop that has a heavy focus or primarily in .NET and C#, it's really an opportunity here, not necessarily to have to use JavaScript or TypeScript, and we can use .NET. So we have the familiar landscape, the ecosystem, things like NuGet packages and that. So the idea here is that we can do full stack C# development. And so if we can do that, then we can use those skills. You're talking about efficiency, productivity, things of that nature. So that ideally is what you want to look at. Now there's also Blazor maturity. We're talking, I think it's 5-ish years since it's come out. This is not cutting edge, like just got released. And then some folks will go, and this is a reasonable question if you've been in other technology stack, like, hey, Alan, is this like Silverlight? No, this is not a plugin. So WebAssembly is adopted independently in the browser. It runs in the sandbox next to JavaScript. So it has the same security model and permissions and things like that. So all of that experience will translate as well. But the big thing is .NET, C# code reuse experience. Let's ball that up and now get into Blazor. Now, obviously, from the persona background, if you've been mostly a back-end developer, something like that, there's going to be a learning curve for like HTML, CSS if you've not been a web developer, but that would be the same no matter which framework you go to. And I get this. This next comment's a little bit subjective, but I'm one of the ones that can say I've been on both sides. I've done Angular, I've done React, I've done Blazor. I think Blazor code, when we get to the views and stuff, is quite intuitive, not messy. It makes sense. The separation of code from the markup, the imperative and declarative, these things, again, that's a subjective comment, but I think it's a really cool stack to work with. So what's under the hood? I mentioned, WebAssembly. And this is where Blazor really shines, because with a lot of the front-end frameworks that are the titans there that I mentioned before with JavaScript, TypeScript, there is an opportunity for a server-side component and pieces and configuration and server-side rendering, but nothing like what Blazor has. So WebAssembly gives us the opportunity, and what it ends up doing is all of what's needed from the .NET runtime is downloaded to the browser because it's been compiled to WASM modules, WebAssembly modules. And once that's in the browser, we can run and execute our code client side, and that includes rendering and routing and all that. Well, if just to connect the dots there, what does that mean for our apps? That's fast, because when you're in the browser and then all the brain work needs to happen in the browser, and this goes back to the other frameworks too, that's why the web development and web applications circa 2012, 13, 14, when Angular and all those came out, they were so quick and people were like, I want a piece of that too. Well, that's what WebAssembly offers us among many things, is this capability to do that in the client. But SignalR, which is a technology probably many folks are familiar with, have been around for a while, what that does is offers a pipe using WebSockets between the client and the server that stays open, and it's very quick for startup. So when you first access the application, and also you can permanently live in either of these worlds. We'll get to this later, but you have the opportunity to select, do I want to be a WebAssembly app? Do I want to be a Signal R, for that? Or do I want both? Yes, you can have your cake and eat it too. And so WebAssembly gives us some really amazing power in the browser, and Signal R complements that with the server side capabilities to keep that open. What's being sent over, that that's the rendered HTML, the data, things of that nature. But once your client side, and the advent of modern application development, once you have the views and all the pieces of the application client side and they've been cached, you're just sending small fragments of data over the wire. And so this is a real nice mix that really shines versus anything else. So what are the benefits we've talked about so far? C#, .NET, WebAssembly, Signal R, client server strength. And we've really built a nice foundation, right? This is a lot of reasoning why Blazor is a sound implementation choice, because that's one of the intangibles to take away. Sure, I'm going to show you all the code and the things, and that's what we want to see. So because we got to develop. But when you start having those conversations of, hey, what are the use cases? We've got this old app at MVC. Are we going to migrate it to Angular, React? Are we going to use Blazor? Which version of Blazor? What can justify it? Because I've got somebody back at work that's saying, we're doing React. And I need to be able to go back and at least, if that's how you feel, say, well, there's some real strength here. And our team is heavily, ingrained in .NET and C#, so this makes sense. So how do we get started? It's not too difficult. So I'll bring up the templates here in a second, but I talked about, we have these opportunities to have a WebAssembly component or Signal R. So since .NET 8, there is a unified application model, a unified model, which is just called the Blazor Web App. And that allows the server and client pieces, and you're able to pick both. But there are also, pre.NET 8, it was, at least conceptually, it was a little bit easier to understand. There was either Blazor WebAssembly or there was Blazor Server. And so WebAssembly was all in as just using the one piece like I showed on the left side of the slide, and Server was the other. And I can show this in a minute, but some might say, well, sounds like what you said about WebAssembly, Alan's pretty cool. Like, why not just use that all the time, right? The thing is that the Achilles heel of the WebAssembly, remember how I said we had to download the .NET runtime and get everything? They're compiled WebAssembly modules. This is not, again, a plugin or anything like that running in WebAssembly. That you take a hit. It's several megabyte of what needs to come down. Now, that has gotten better and more efficient and on production builds. And if your use case is an intranet app, and by the way, once this stuff gets downloaded, it doesn't have to happen again. Unless there's like a major, upgrade or something like that. So you take a hit for a few seconds. A few seconds is not a big deal on an internet app. Somebody pulls up your site, their business line of business, they reach for their coffee, and by the time they look back over, it's probably loading. But if you're like a storefront on the internet and somebody has to wait 3 or 4 seconds for your site to come up, that's bad. That smells. If people access a site and that takes that long, people go, well, this is fishy. Is this legitimate, or what's wrong with this site? You may not think that at the moment, but I mean, even if we pull up anything like Amazon or whatever, we expect to see something right away. And that's where the power of the server as a means to an end will say, here, I'm going to serve up this pre-rendered HTML very quickly so we get the user appeased. And in the background, we're going to download the WebAssembly bits. And then once that happens, we can do that kind of handshake. That's my word. It's not technically that, but we can start using WebAssembly. So you can have the best of both worlds with some of those rendering options. So let's go in and look at in Visual Studio, and I'll show my demo app here in a minute, and we'll use that as the backdrop. But if you were starting new, let's actually just open a new window here so I don't accidentally add a project to this. And yep, just started using 2026, and I do like it. It's been pretty smooth experience so far. How many people are this is not a requirement for Blazor, by the way, but how many people are using 2026? Pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah, it's nice. I mean, I use Visual Studio Code a lot, which is obviously very lightweight and such. So when you open up Visual Studio, it's kind of like an aircraft carrier. It's like, that speaking of go, like, I'm going to open Visual Studio and take a 30 seconds or whatever to load this project, but it's pretty nice, I think, the new one. So if we want to create a new project, and so let's see if we can make this larger. So obviously we're going to search for Blazor, and I want to show some of the different options. So we said the new unified project template right here, Blazor web app. Now, again, for folks that are new, it might be fuzzy still, like the whole, what are you talking about, render modes or interactivity and such. So again, just building up with those technologies that I talked about. But within this, you would be able to make those selections and configure that behavior. And we'll talk about that. But this is not focused strictly on rendering. We want to get to the components as well. But to show you the Blazor server app and the Blazor WebAssembly standalone app, you can still, dry and concrete one of those two technologies if you so choose to. My particular demo app is a Blazor WebAssembly standalone application. I think the technology is awesome. It also transparently started before .NET 7, so I've kept that project template. But one cool thing and one use case for that would be like if you needed a static file deployment to a CDN or something like that, this would be an opportunity you could use that, because then you don't need SignalR or any of those .NET pieces, so you can have a lean deployment type, which gets into, architecture and things of that nature. But think of this word, flexibility. And I think the other day I said in the workshop, it's kind of like a buffet. I like buffets because I like to pick all the different things that I can eat. Blazor is kind of like that too. It's like, well, I want this and I want this and I want this. Fine, you can have it like that, or you can choose these other three like this. It's highly configurable and customizable to what your requirements drive. So there's no single answer to what you use when you create a project. When you click through, if we use the unified app model, and of course you pick where you want it to exist, but here's some of the options. Obviously, we need to pick the framework. So we've got, now Net 10 or Net 9, 8. And listen, again, I just want to say you don't have to use Net 10 to use Blazor. Like if you're in the enterprise and like, no, we're still using 8, no problem. You'll still get all these, features. They incrementally added some nice features in 9. 8 is good. 8 was the big change, like from 7 to 8. So if you have to be in like 7, that's a little like, can we get to 8 at least? 10 would be ideal, obviously. We'll skip by authentication because the easiest thing to do with authentication is anonymous. Then you just let everybody in and you don't have to configure security. It's a lot easier. It's a lot faster. That's a joke, by the way. I hope everybody has had coffee this morning. Rocky does, Rocky Locky, if you've probably seen some of those, we do security on Monday, and I always ask him because it's convoluted, all the security setup. I'm like, Rocky, why don't we just make it anonymous and then we're done, And it's like, no, you can't do that. But here are the real options that we want to highlight. Interactive render mode, I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but those different technologies, none, which would be essentially static content for like blogs and such. Server, where we're using, again, SignalR, WebAssembly, or Auto. Auto is the AKA have your cake and eat it too. You get both. And then we have the interactivity location. You can actually configure this per component or at the global level. And if you, let me get out of the zoom there. And if you look at a project that uses that unified template, if you use interactive auto, which is again, you get both, you're going to be set up with two applications. The first one is going to be the server project, and the second one's the client. So when it starts running on the client, all the components and pieces that are within here are the ones that run with WebAssembly, and then this is the server side component of that. But we need to digress a little bit, and we need to get into the components themselves and building the application. But that should highlight pretty quickly how easy it is to just get up and running with one of the new templates. Yes, go ahead.
So I'm using React, and then I noticed I deployed a React app, and wouldn't tool indexing wouldn't pick up the pages at all because it wasn't that server side.
Yeah.
What would you pick for Blazor to that Google index?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have a React deployment here, and it's not being indexed because of client-side technologies. This is one of the things. And even in React, you can use what's known as SSR, server-side. It's a whole bunch of extra configuration, and Angular has it too. But in Blazor, the way that that's hedged is when it uses the server-side technology and the newer Blazor web app template, it pre-renders the HTML and it sends the initial static content before it becomes interactive. And that helps with indexing and SEO and such because that initial content can be served up. And then almost in the blink of an eye, it becomes interactive and the rest of the page ends up loading. But that's how that gets solved. So which one would you pick? If you picked, actually, believe it or not, even the WebAssembly Interactive still has a server component to it. So in that app model, the whole pre-rendering part is going to be baked in, but especially with the server and auto, which has both, you're going to be you should be able to manage that situation a lot better. Say again? I'm not saying you should pick auto. There's some trade-offs to auto because which is a little bit beyond today. But the thing is that maybe some of you have already drawn this conclusion. It's like, great, well, you start on the server and then you end up in WebAssembly and things like state change. There's a new persistent state mechanism that's new in .NET 10 to assist with that. But there's a little bit of a transition because they're partners, but they're also mutually exclusive. So you have to understand that trade-off. And if it's too much of a headache, you might say, there's a decision tree, you might say, why don't we just stick with server? Because we get the pre-rendered HTML, everything's on the server side. It's just a simpler, conceptual model. We don't have to deal with WebAssembly. And the only use case you don't go down that route is because of the signal or pipe, if you have more than a couple thousand concurrent users, that can bring that down. But not everybody concurrent, not throughout the day. But if you had that many concurrent users and you say, well, you have to either move over to like Azure SignalR hubs to increase that, or you need WebAssembly to bring that down. So the decision tree for some of these, I have a slide toward the end that'll try to highlight some of that, but just know that the pre-rendered HTML is going to help with that situation. So web components, these are the building blocks and the core kind of architectural premise of modern web development. So maybe in the past we've used monolithic views. You go to a contact or a order or whatever, you're in insurance, medical, whatever, and basically you had maybe like one ASPX view that was the entire deal. But with web components, it's not really a brain bender. They're like Legos. So you might have, one component and then you have other components. And the idea is reuse and they can communicate with each other. And we're going to talk about that, about how they communicate, but it's small, cohesive, chunks of functionality to build up your view. And there's no exact recipe on how far you break that down. I've said before, you don't go to the nth degree and like a label's a component and this is a component, but in ideally you have some, chunks of code that can be used and that these are components with reusability. So let's take a look at this application. I'm just going to run it real quick. It's called and it's in my GitHub and there's a link at the end. It's called the Engine Analytics Web App. This is actually a Net 10 Blazor standalones. But from here till pretty much the rest of the time we have, we're going to be focused on building the application. I will come back to the rendering decisions toward the end to highlight that. And did you see the little spinner there? Let me see if I can, I'll do empty cache and hard reload. That's what's being downloaded to the browser. So taking a little bit of a hit there because this is a WebAssembly standalone. But just looking at this from a functionality, it's just a means to an end. It uses the base template that's just been scaled out a little bit. So the idea here is that you can put in some data. We've got a form here, and this is just to highlight. So we'll put in something like 2209, 2009, Shelby, GT 500 KR, 3930. and does a quarter mile in 11.4 seconds. Okay. So then it does some calculations. You see the toast notification, successfully saved calculations. There's some other things in here. You can do displacement or torque. You have an expanding menu on the side that actually uses Bootstrap. So we can see that output right here. And this is a Bootstrap grid. And then I can filter if I want to. I can clear that filter. I can see some of the other results purposely using different grids. In these different ones, you may see some differences here on how they behave. This one has paging on it. It uses a Blazorized grid. Even, I don't think I'll have time to show this today, but if I can, I'll sneak it in. Dynamic components. So all of these, like what you're seeing here is like, I'm going to show you in a second, but these are components that build this. And this is actually two components. The year, make, and model is one component. The weight and the other part's another component. And then the page inside is actually a component as well. So you've got three components at work. Nav is a component. We have the main layout. We have different components that comprise this view right here. So this is the 99.9% of the time. We design our app, this component here, and profile and edit and, you know, reporting and finance data, whatever you're doing. But I have had this requirement in the past. We don't know what component, or it's a widget, or it's configurable. Well, Blazor allows you to load dynamic components. So right here, I pick from a dropdown, it just happens to be what I'm using, and then it loads that component dynamically. So a little bit of maybe a niche requirement, but just bookmark that you can do this. And then at the bottom, I have track weather. And so you can put in, I forget what the zip code is here. Let's guess at it. Yay, I knew what it was, 32810. All right, Orlando. So that pulls the current temperature, and you can even, this uses the JavaScript API. So right here, the browser APIs, that it will get the latitude and longitude. I'll show that toward the end. So that's me tapping into JavaScript from Blazor. That makes a browser call to get the current user's location, because maybe the idea is you take this to a track and you're entering this information and you need to get the weather for the current track location. But again, all this stuff is just a means to an end. Let's go ahead and look at the application and how I have this structured. So in this particular one, I have my my main project, which is with the UI here. And I want to show you some of the composition and how this one works, starting from the entry point. But do know we also have this Razor class library where the components are that allow, the Razor class library is another project template which allows us to house our components in it. And then I also have a lazy loaded component, which is really an applicable technique if you've ever done web development before. If you're doing pure WebAssembly and you want to be efficient and you want to not load something until it's needed, you could do that. But I will say, this is not an often used technique if you're using interactive auto or the auto rendering, because it is in itself kind of a lazy loading. It's like, we're going to start with server, and in the background, unbeknownst to the user, we'll download WebAssembly and everything that's needed. And then when that's ready, we'll switch over and use that instead. So, but you can do it. This is the thing about Blazor. There's not many, you're not going to hit a lot of walls. Like, you need something, it's how many different options. Just like I said with the buffet, it's pretty cool. This shared layer is like many projects, and this should, for the .NET and C# developers that have been doing it for eons, but maybe not Blazor. Now you're just, this is the neat thing, is like, you'll see it a lot in here. You'll be like, Alan, that's just C# and .NET. I can do that all day long. Absolutely. You know, all your skills, object-oriented program practice, how you structure projects, you just need to get the Blazor parts in there. But you come down here, you know, I've got, you know, interface and the automobile data local storage service. Let me just get these windows out of the way down here. So there's nothing really too much Blazor specific in this. This is just .NET code. And yes, you could do architectures where you're like, oh, the Blazor is a very thin layer. I'm making an API call, and then the backend has backend for front end and Azure architecture and all the things in service bus and whatever you need. You know, so really when we talk about Blazor, we're talking about that, you know, presentation layer. So even though when I say server side or server component, you're probably not going to have like all your business rules and everything in there. You're gonna have presentation layer logic, just like you would with any other front end. So moving along, looking at those components, remember how I said here, for example, the entry point in this one, I'll show you how it looks. So if I go into index.html, there is the Blazor WebAssembly JS. Now, so what happens is when the server requests this via the route, you pull up whatever the route is, it downloads index.html, which then gets this JavaScript file. There is one thing here, which is this Blazor ID app. The ID is app. And what that'll do is when Blazor WebAssembly.js loads, that ended ultimately, if you see in program.js, here's the glue, which glues that app ID to the app component. And the app component, if I go into that, has our router. So whatever route has been requested in the browser will load the main layout. And the main layout is probably what you were expecting with the nav menu on the left. The main section here, we have the body, which is a render fragment. Essentially what happens is whenever you route to something like one of the engine analytics or such, when we route to it, the content from the component is rendered right here. And so from there, for example, like I said, and if we look at the nav menu quickly, and I'll talk a little bit more about routing, but this just fits in well right here. Those links on the left, which are Blazor components, these have the href here, so like horsepower results, torque results, and so those will end up ultimately matching the routes from, if I go into the pages right here, and then take a look, for example, at like calculate displacement. See, this is where we dictate the routing. And then remember how I said there's multiple components? So this is what gets rendered in the app body render fragment within the main layout. And then within that, we have a page title and some other markup right here, but we have the displacement calculation component. This is our custom component that we've created, our Blazor component. And if I sync this up, this is going to be down in the components directory right here. So here's displacement calculation. I'll go more into the syntax here in a minute. I'm just kind of giving you a lay of the land of how you're composing the application so you can begin to see, okay, we've got the application and I've got these components. So I can start to think, okay, I need a customer component, but that's probably, maybe the top level, and maybe it gets the data and then it's got components within here, and then I can call it out, because how do you might say, hey, Alan, how do I have another component within this main component? Well, look at line 7. Do you remember how I said year, make, and model was one component on that view? That's it right there. And if I jump into that, I'm going to sync up over on here. This is just another Blazor component. And it's got HTML markup mixed with Razor syntax. I'll talk a little more about that again, just, excuse me, starting from the top and moving down. And you can see in here, we have the year, make, and model, and we have some data binding. Again, I'll highlight that more here in a minute. Let me give us some real estate. And let me jump back to the other view. All right, so we'll bubble back up, and then we'll look over here again. So we have some pages here. We have layouts. You can have different layouts if you need to. You can have different structures, so maybe depending on the persona of who's using the application, although oftentimes you'll just have one layout. And I always mention this, if you're new to web, make sure use like semantic HTML best you can. So you see this like main tag and article. This is not Blazor or footer. These are good for accessibility and screen reader, which should be at the forefront if you're a web developer. If you're new, that's okay. Accessibility will be something that you will need to incorporate for your users, whether it's an internal or an external application. I've actually been on clients, been a few years, where a mainstay application that's been around for years, they were like, oops, we don't have accessibility. And there was a major effort to have to go back in and audit it and use some tooling. Of course, now I would be remiss to not mention with this or anything, AI tooling to assist in that. So if you were in that spot, you can always ask, if you're using like GitHub Copilot, help me with accessibility. How does this, stand up? And then there are independent tools. You can use that to assist in your journey. But That's what I'm doing right there. So back over here, we had the reports and we have the weather components. Now, if I move down to that Razor class library, this is where you have some of those like displacement calculation. Those are the components that are within the that are on those pages themselves, and you can lay that out however you need to. You might work on a Blazor application where you see the page has a lot. Just try to not make monolithic components. If you have a handful of takeaways from this talk and you're getting to building components, try to avoid that. Actually, if I could even be opinionated here for a second, please avoid that. And what I mean by that is all over the years, I've watched this journey as the community, myself included, when we start to have to wrap our mind and our experience around new technology, what ends up happening is that it's a quasi survival move just to get it to work, and patterns and practices become secondary. It's natural, it happens. So I've come into Angular applications before, and like one controller or component, depending on how old it was, it'd be thousands of lines, and it didn't need to be. That was unnecessary, and it creates spaghetti code. It makes it hard to maintain and things of that nature. So I'm sure a lot of the folks in here are experienced in technology already and software engineering and things like unit testing and thinking about testing and such. Just use that same mindset and just apply it to Blazor. And then again, whether it's a peer on a pull request or maybe GitHub Copilot, if you create something like this, you could just do a quick ask and say, hey, any recommendations to break this down? Anything scream like it could be its own component? Yeah, Alan, you could refactor that block right there probably and just use a component parameter that gets sent in, higher reuse, and then if you need to reuse this later. Versus, no, this is pretty tight, makes sense, let's stick with what you got. And again, on a PR, if you notice that from one of your teammates, you're building a Blazor app and you say, hey, Alan, why don't you go ahead and, make a comment and why don't you break this down? This is getting a little bit unwieldy here. It looks like it's doing more than one thing for its primary responsibility. So on and so forth. We can go down into here. And again, I have like the filter. Remember when I filtered on that grid? That's its own component as well. So there's a bit of reuse because that filter can take in that value and then apply the filter. There's a pretty awesome capability within Blazor to do things like this and that level of reuse because of the way that components kind of should live on an island, but they are supported by the data that's either passed to them or passed back up. Because in Blazor, what we're really looking at with the components is the components are in a hierarchical tree and how they're rendered and how they behave. So parent to child can impact rendering, and not only rendering, but how data is passed and such. So you have a great capability to do that between your components. All right, so that's kind of a high-level look at the structure or a structure of an application. Now, yeah, go ahead, question.
So can we keep that the shared components in another solution and use it in other applications?
Yeah, so the question was, can we keep the shared, that shared DLL actually, or it was that was just a old school class library. Yes, you could use that in something else because that shared library, I think in my particular case, has one NuGet package that does relate to Blazor, but I'm pretty sure I could refactor that to maybe not have to use that, and it'd be very agnostic to the technology stack and move it. But not only that, one other cool thing, that Razor class library, that was my engine analytics.components, that too is also portable. Now, we don't always have to be thinking like libraries and stuff within the enterprise. I mean, that's a lot of work to have that level of surface where it's so highly reusable. But you also can do that if you need that effort and you're like, well, we built these really cool components and they work on all of our different enterprise applications. By all means, do that. So yes, you can absolutely do that. How does CI/CD work with this? Well, you can configure your builds however you need to. So there's no impact, like Blazor is not going to necessarily intervene or make that different. You can, just quickly to touch on that, and you can build your Blazor application and then have it deployed to the cloud if needed. It can go to an Azure App Service. It can go to a container, whatever you need. If you're talking about those shared and you're making like a NuGet package, you could do something like that if you were doing that level of reuse. Yeah, so those capabilities exist.
Yeah, how about the incorporating environmental companies like Pellerin or
How do those components, how do third-party components work? They work great, and it's actually encouraged. I think I have a slide on that toward the end, but these components are all responsive. And you don't want to recreate the wheel to create a calendar or a grid or autocomplete box or things of that nature. So the PSA on that is use a well-known and adopted in the community open source component library rather than starting from scratch. And if they're for Blazor, they'll have events and tie-ins. And whether you use a free one versus a paid one, that's an independent decision about support. And typically the paid ones will be faster to adopt, like say .NET 10 or security or those kinds of things, versus the open source ones that you're relying on the community might be a little bit behind. Yeah, no problem. So let's take a look a little bit closer at the views, because the Razor syntax, we need to understand, what we're looking at. Remember how I said, this is part of the learning curve in that. So let's go into horsepower calculation, because that is a good representation of this. And so let's take a look at we remember, this is where we were entering the data for the calculation. So we have what's known as an edit form. This comes from ASP.NET and Blazor that allows us to bind to it a model and have events off of it. Like, is it a valid submit? Is it an invalid submit? And you say, hey, Alan, what's that what does that translate to? Well, that translates to a method over here in code that's going to handle, in this case, a valid submission, and then ultimately call off to an injected service. But let's focus on the views for a second. And again, I mentioned we have a composition of components. I'll talk about this cascading value when we talk about passing values along within here. But what you're looking at are the Razor syntax. Like here, there's a conditional. If the horsepower is not null, then I need to show some of this information, whatever the markup is. So you're seeing the mix of native HTML, CSS like classes. These happen to be Bootstrap classes. And then Blazor itself with the Blazor syntax. And the Blazor syntax, when you're looking at things like data binding, and what am I doing? I'm binding a value on a property on an object. So the conceptual model here on a lot of components is you're getting data, and that's just .NET C#. There's not, you're making probably a call to an injected service. You're getting some data, or it might be passed in as a component parameter. And then that you're binding to, maybe first name, last name. Maybe you've got a little component up in the corner and it says hello. And then you would bind to first name and last name. Hello, Alan Conway. And then under that, maybe you have a link that says edit profile. And what does that have? That has a nav link that goes to the edit profile component, which might be a shell. And depending on the type of customer, you have different sections on the screen of what they can edit. I haven't fully registered. So right now my edit profile has a limited number of fields, but a fully registered user of your, company, product, whatever, has many more fields. How do you do that? Well, maybe, in the case, it's like you toggle off of the type of customer. And maybe you're not inlining full blocks here. You'd have two different components. Or you'd have one component called edit profile that passes in the customer information and then can decide the templates. You see how this works? Like you can begin to compose your views and how is needed for the requirements that drive it. So looking down, now you should start to see some repetition in a good way and start to digest this. So if you're brand new to web development, what do you need to learn? You need to, brush up or get back into, understanding, HTML, a little bit of layout. But again, we're in 2025. That's what you can use AI tooling to help you along in that journey and say, here's what I need. I need to understand it. I need to learn it. Can you scaffold that for me? Then you can audit it, you can work with it, and that ebb and flow between it. So you've got some catalysts. But there's also great just to start from the ground up and read the documentation or whatever, just so you can get back into that. If you're already a web developer and coming from another area, all you have to do is lace in this syntax and then you can move along. So the next thing that we have here is the code. And the Blazor component code is our C# and .NET code. And we can either have it directly in a code directive within the view, which is the default, or you can have it in a C# file separately in the tree view in Solution Explorer. It doesn't matter what you pick. It has no bearing. When it builds, it'll all be the same. Just be consistent throughout your application on that. One of the things, it is subjective. It's funny because if anybody's still here from that did attend the pre-con, Rocky and I always banter with each other. Funny because he likes the code directly in the view itself. So I think if in this demo app, let me see if I've got a default code block in one of these. There, this is what it would look like. So if you've got the code directly in with your view and Razor markup as well. The way I have it structured is that if you come over to horsepower calculation, I said add new class. And if you use the same naming convention, horsepower calculation.razor, and add the .cs, make this a partial class, it will wire that up to the view and be associated, and then you can have your C# over here. My background, again, going all the way back to the original .NET, inception and ASP.NET, I'm just super familiar with this style of a separate code file. I like seeing my CSS in one file. I like seeing my HTML and Razor in one file, and I like seeing C# in another. That's just me. Yeah, question. What happened to VB? VB6 or no? VB.NET is still supported, but I don't think you can use VB.NET in Blazor. Correct me if I'm wrong, but are you wanting to use VB for Blazor? You are. Okay, yeah, I don't believe you can use, that's so crazy you asked me that. I should know that because I used VB.NET for years, and I use VB. I was telling people the other day, it's so crazy. It's like riding a bicycle. I could all of a sudden be like, dim last name as string. Like I used to do that stuff all the time. Other people here are going, oh, so I don't know. We can look at that after and see if that, because I think in the template, I don't think you can make it VB. Well, the one thing you might have to, that's an edge case. Let's take that one offline.
So if we add it as a WebAssembly or we choose the interactive model as a client, so then your page doesn't have a CS file. So then you have to create a post section in the view itself.
If it's based on if it's WebAssembly, what was the question versus?
If it is a WebAssembly, then you don't have the .cs.
Great question. So the question was, if it's WebAssembly, do you not have a CS class, right? No, you do. You can. That's the cool thing, because WebAssembly can run .NET in the browser. So none of this changes based on if you have WebAssembly or server. All this component building, which is the real meat and potatoes, stays exactly the same. So this code, when it gets compiled, it will also get compiled to a WASM module, your actual application code, not just all the .NET supporting cast. And this will run in the browser. And you don't have to code in JavaScript or anything. That's like the really cool part. I love that question. Yeah. So if you do the code, just remember it'll put it right here. But this is, some of that comes from probably like the React world and some modern component development, because in that world, it is desired. It's like CSS and JS, JSX, the JavaScript. I have a component. Why should it not show me everything? That's a fair point. So we don't need to spend a ton of time on this. Just get consistent on whatever your team likes and probably don't mix and match. But the code itself, no, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because this is just old hat C# and .NET. I've got primary constructor injected services here. I'm setting up objects and variables. The one thing that I will highlight is when you have, if you're newer to Blazor, if you have properties here that are just on the class, these are just like a status message and alert class. See how they're getting set to these values? If I go back to the view, you will see that they are bound. This is the data bound property right here. And this is cool because this CSS class is dynamic based on whatever this that has been changed. And so when those toast notifications came up, it said like in green, successfully saved. It can also be red if there's a problem. And so like alert danger, required fields are missing, things like that. But getting into here, this is the code behind. Next up is just hammering home some of that component binding. And I did show that. So we have one way, which I just showed right now, like at username or that status message. This is not, the user is not changing it. This is just, the hello Alan Conway or whatever. And one-way data binding is going to be used a lot. Now, two-way is like our form. So the form the user could enter, or maybe we pre-fill the form from data that's coming in. That's two-way data binding. And so we have the capability to do both. And if you've already done web development in Angular, React, or whatever, this one-way and two-way, the conceptual model behind it is very familiar to that. The syntax in Razor is a little different because you can bind to the native parameter or properties on those elements, whether you're using a native HTML element or whether you are using a Blazor component. So if I show you some of that, if I go hop back over what I'm talking about here, if we go back to the horsepower calculation, you'll see here that I purposely left this commented out code because this is a native HTML input. This is an input number, which is basically a helper that's available in Blazor that still uses an input when it renders, and it has some niceties to it, but the binding syntax is just a tad different because with the native element, you see here it's a lowercase v because we're binding to that directly on that element versus this bind value. But overall, that's not the real takeaway. It's the fact that we can bind to it and we can have that data, and whenever they enter it, you don't have getters and setters like in the view. So if anybody hasn't seen this yet and you're like, oh, Alan, you probably have a bunch of like for every single property and they change it and then you've got to like hydrate objects. It happens seamlessly. This is modern data binding. It's so cool. So if weight changes, it changes on that automobile object. I don't have to have like a physical statement in my C# code to make that happen. And then of course we also have those methods, which I showed as well. So you have events like handle, valid, submit, or clear form, which was, if I go back over here, I think that was, where was that? Right here, clear form. And so, if you want to clear it and whatever the data was in there, we can clear that instead of maybe clearing it on submission. Let's talk about styling. Now, this is the one that usually folks get a little intimidated by if they're new to web development and they're strong .NET developers, but they're coming back to the top end. They might say, ugh, I don't like styling, but it's a required part of our rich user experience in building Blazor applications. But the good thing is that you can use something like a responsive framework to just be a nice catalyst out of the box. In fact, the default template includes Bootstrap, but you can use Tailwind or whatever. It's not the opinionated, whatever you like, and essentially use those classes to help have a nice alignment in the UI and things of that nature. So one of the other things, speaking of opinionated, is Blazor itself is not that opinionated on preprocessors. So out of the box, you're going to use CSS. If you so choose and want less or Sass, you'll need to add in that preprocessor, but it's not that difficult. I'll show you how to do it. Also, CSS isolation offers DOM encapsulation. This is really cool. Every single component can have its own CSS file, and it doesn't step on the toes of other CSS because it creates higher level specificity through these index values that are added to the selectors and to the styles, and it's done automatically by Blazor. I will show you that in a second. I put this together, and you don't have to read through all this, but I wanted a preprocessor. I wanted Sass, so I went through a bunch, and there was a lot of misleading information when I started doing the research. Things like Web Optimizer at the bottom that have nothing to do with Blazor, but would still show up like when I did searches about what I should use. That's for MVC. That's .NET middleware. That doesn't even make sense in MVC. Then there were other ones that were, they were out of date or they weren't working well. And then I wanted a .NET solution because we want to be in .NET. I don't really want to have to jump back into the JavaScript world because there's very powerful options there. Gulp, Grunt, Vite, all these different ones that we can use, but I'd prefer not to. So what I ended up with is Dart SaaS Builder is pretty easy to use. It's I'll show it to you. It's a NuGet package. Essentially on build, if you have a SAS file that's in the component tree, because you use that same naming convention, just like we did with the CS, as soon as you say build, guess what you get? You get the CSS that goes along with it. And with this CSS isolation, this is what I was talking about. See all that goobly-gop, the B-N, whatever? The nav item, that's a class, ends up getting that, again, to create that higher level specificity. You don't have to do this. This is just explaining how this works. And I'm going to show it to you in the browser and what that looks like. So let's take a look at each of these pieces within our application. Let's go up to the top level and we're going to look at the nav menu. All right, so if I zoom in on the nav menu, ordinarily what you would see, let's see if I go back to this default application, you can see this is the bare bones application. You're going to get a CSS file by default. If you use the naming convention, if there's not one and you add it, it will fall under the nested tree as long as it has the correct name and it will get associated with that component. Pretty slick. But over in ours, I have a SAS file. And again, SAS is a higher level language. So if you're new coming back to styling, things like, and CSS has gotten a lot better, but mix-ins, and there's still some power in a preprocessor that you may want to take advantage of. So I've got that one there. And then also in home, I've got this SAS file as well. And you notice here, just for this very simple example, see how I'm using this variable instead of directly inlining that color so that there's reuse. And again, plain CSS does have some pretty decent power these days, but I just want to get the concept across, so how this works. So if I go up to here and say manage NuGet packages, you will see one that pops up here called Dart SaaS Builder. And again, use whatever. I'm not advocating for this one particular open source project. It happened to work well. The only caveat to Dart SaaS Builder being open source is they take their time targeting the newer versions of .NET. So sometimes you have to have an older SDK in order for it to build. I think in this case, I think it's still targeting 8, but it works seamlessly aside from that. So I have Dart SaaS Builder installed, and the only place you're going to see any evidence of that is if you edit the project file, you will see that there's a little bit of configuration that says this, I didn't have to hand roll this. This got automatically. It will use compressed output. But when we're in debug, it will use expanded, so it makes it easier to debug. So if you go back over to that styling file, when I build, ta-da, I get the CSS file right below it. And if you look at that CSS file, no longer is that variable. Remember the variable I showed you right here? It's not in there anymore. It has been transpiled, and now this is what will end up getting sent to the browser. Now, you don't need to use that SaaS Builder, Dart SaaS Builder. You can use plain CSS if you want. That's awesome too. How does this all work when I build overall? Let's take a step back and not focus on SAS, but just all the style files that are there. So you see all these style files. When I build, it creates the scoped styles bundle. And that scope styles bundle then gets associated in the project. And in this case, it's going to be right here in index.html. Depending on the project template, it may be in a different location, but I also didn't have to manually add this. This was scaffolded for me out of the box. This is that bundle. So every single style from all the Blazor components gets put together, and Blazor will take care of delivering it to the browser so that they're all available. So let me spin it up. We're going to look at the debugger here. I'll pull it up, and I'm going to show you that that's sent to the browser. Go ahead and inspect. We'll go to sources. Oh, come here. I'll zoom in where it is. So in sources here, There's the scope styles bundle. And you see all the selectors that were added? That happened on build. I didn't have to do any of that. And that keeps the styles from bleeding from one component to the other. You might also say, hey, Alan, you've got that Blazor component separate library, and maybe I have another one. What if I add styles there? Do I have to add like a second reference, to the index.html? Nope. Blazor's super cool. You see these import statements up here? It could see in my solution where all those Blazor components were, and it automatically swooped them up and imported all of them for me. So why did I show that to you? Because I want you to understand that there's the styling per component. You can get right to work and just work on that. And you don't have to worry about all these other bits and pieces. All right, let's look at a really important topic here, which is passing data. We have all these components, but we need to be able to communicate across. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this. This is not an exhaustive list, but we can use route parameters. On the route, we could send a value or a query string or a component parameter. So on the component itself, we can pass in a value. We can use cascading parameters through the tree hierarchy that go from parent to child and on down the stream. And we can also use services. We can inject a service and then we can pull data from it. So if they're disparate all over the tree and they're like, disconnected, well, we just use a service as the conduit. And so a lot of this stuff, some of it's web specific, but some like services, that's just old hat.net, like I was talking about. So let's go ahead and take a look at passing data. We're going to start with the, and actually, since I still have it running, let me just show you what I'm about to. This track weather rate, let me close that down. This component, this message component, has this string right here, but the component itself does not contain that value. So let's go ahead and look at track weather right here. All right, so the track weather has that messaging component. This is the component parameter message right here, and we pass in this value. No, you wouldn't normally be passing hard-coded strings. You can have an object, you can have a variable, property, whatever you want to. But you just want you to understand how that's working. So we have a message component, which is on that track weather. And notice, by the way, how many different components I have here. So you can see the layout, that this is 20 lines, not, if I expanded all of these, you'd have hundreds and hundreds of lines. So that goes back to something I talked about earlier. So if I go into the message component, and let's take a look at the code associated with this component. Right here, we have this parameter attribute on this property called message. That is what we use. And if we go to the message component itself, we don't bind directly the message raw. This shows you that what we end up doing is on initialize, which is one of the life cycle events of the component. We take that message value and we call off and we format it. And so the formatted message, which is right here, that's actually what gets bound. But I could have just taken verbatim too, whatever was on there. So that's an example of a message of a component parameter. Anybody who may have done Angular before, that probably looks really familiar, that pattern. Let's go to back to maybe like displacement calculation. I had showed this earlier. So auto group is wrapped with this cascading value, cascading parameter, which is automobile. So automobile is sourced from this component. Automobile is created and then ultimately hydrated from here, but it has properties on it that need to also get hydrated in year, make, and model. So in this case, the auto group uses that which has been passed to it, and it's defined the cascading parameter, which is automobile. And so this is an opportunity in a hierarchy that you can pass a parameter downstream from parent to child and making sure that they will get that value. Another example of it is we can communicate from a child back up to a parent. So let's take a look at the horsepower data grid. And so within here, we have the horsepower filter. So remember on that grid where we could put a filter and then refine what was within that? So this horsepower filter, I'm going to go into it. We'll start there. This is the child. And what we have defined within the code is an event callback. It is a parameter on filter applied. So what happens is, if you start connecting the dots, is that when they add a filter, when I typed it in, and then they say apply filter will invoke async on the on filter applied. Now, how that works is when we go back to the horsepower data grid, it has that property here. So for on filter applied, which was defined, we're saying now call handle filter applied. And then that I can do whatever I want to in there. It calls apply model filter, and then it applies that filter to the collection. So this is a way we can go from child back up to parent in that case. We also have down here the weather service. Now I'll go into, let me get to the weather and then services and then the weather service. This is I'll stop this one right here. This is a nice example if you end up pulling this code of using observables. And so it used the RX extensions.NET NuGet package. And this is independent concept, but the idea in component-based development, remember how I said we have to communicate? Well, if you're communicating from here to here or one-to-one or down a couple, that's great. But what if you have like a stock ticker application and your company's, or it's just, you know, something for your company, but it has stock price, but it's in like 4 different locations on different screens. So you can reuse that component, but which one has to get the data and how do you manage that? You know, so what you can do is you can use an observable like pub sub pattern that you will have one component, maybe the parent, that gets the data, and then it just publishes, it just streams it and says, here's the data I have. Here's the value. And then every component that's interested in that data, no matter where it is, can subscribe and say, I'm interested in that data. So if it changes, you know, I will be able to get that information asynchronously. And that's exactly what's happening here. Not enough time to really dive deep into this, but this behavior subject right here, what ends up happening is when they change the zip code for the weather, it just says, hey, the zip code changed. It doesn't dictate who should change their data or what. So back on that page, I had the current weather, but I could have had the future weather and others. And each component needs to know when the zip code changes so that it can update that information as well. And so if I go into the weather current and weather location, we can look at this. Let me go up here to the weather current. And if you see here, this is me subscribing to when that zip code changes. And I do that asynchronously, and it calls this method right here. And what do you think it does? Well, it goes and gets the current weather because it was interested when the zip code changed. This is a very nice pattern to do when you're working with components. You don't have to. This is just .NET. This has nothing to do with Blazor. Yeah, question. Say again about the observable?
There's an observable that needs to be disposed.
Oh, how does it need to, the cleanup of that? Yeah, that's a pretty rudimentary example right there. So that's going to be in the RxNet about the handling of that, and do you need to dispose that when the component, which right there actually have the subscription tracked. So that one right there, you can see this subscription is tracked and then done that. That's a little beyond today, and I've only got about 5 minutes, but I just want to, if you get into RxNet, I recommend just looking at the best patterns and practices on working with observables. Okay, a couple more key features that I want to get through. We already looked at routing. I showed you the router, that it was in the app component. And I also showed you the page directive that's at the top of each component that defines the route, and then the nav link in our particular application that could route to that. And so there is a robust router, whether you're using client side or server side. Just one main takeaway about routing is it is again configured at the component level. There's no centralized config that you can go to and see like all the routes. There's some tools that you can use later, like in the browser, to see the routing, but just know that that meta information is within the component. And I also talked about the rendering modes. We've already talked a little bit about this, but there are some different options. Static server, which is just pure static content. There's no interactivity, no buttons, no forms. This would be great for like a blog or an info page or something. It's highly efficient, very fast, but it's not interactive. Then there's interactive server, which the startup speed is very quick. It's also, we talked about earlier, and what it does is that it will allow you to, it sends pre-rendered content that is not interactive, but it gets the user happy. Oh, I see something. And a flash later, then the interactivity is there. You can usually manage that within your components by saying it in .NET 9 and later, there is a render mode attribute that you can plop in the view if needed. And you can, remember the if conditional? You can basically say, if we're not interactive, show some message like, loading view or something like that. And then when it becomes interactive, boom, the rest of the stuff will show up. So like one conditional, you can do that. You might not even need that. You might just say, it might just take a second, have the pre-rendered content, and then very quickly later. And then interactive WebAssembly. Oh, that's basically the WebAssembly like I showed. It's not Blazor WebAssembly standalone, but when it's going to show some pre-rendered content, but it's going to require WebAssembly to be downloaded before the rest of the app will become functional. But that's one use case. And then interactive auto, it's initially server, then it becomes client. This is kind of the best of the both worlds. But as I mentioned, and it's a little bit beyond today because we had so much to cover about components and such. But again, as I mentioned, because it starts on the server and then ends up on the client, there's some that you may have to manage with a disconnect with the state management and such. It may or may not be a problem. You just have to figure out what your requirements and how that works. All right, really quickly, I do want to show you calling JavaScript from Blazor because there's an interop pattern that you can use if you need to. And you can call JavaScript code from .NET, and you can call .NET from JavaScript. Strongly consider C# first and in .NET, but sometimes we have something that we must absolutely need to use. So this is going to be down in the weather pieces here. Let me expand this out. The weather location. And the cool thing is, you can see if you use that same naming convention, everything will nest under your component. Ah, that looks great. Got my C# file, my JavaScript file, and my Sass styling file. So here I have some JavaScript that gets the current geolocation. Remember the latitude and longitude that showed up on the screen? I'm not going to teach any JavaScript right now, but that's basically using the get current position. What's important is over and there's a recipe for this, but basically you get the JS runtime, it gets injected, and then we are able to call it by right here. You can see that we JS invoke, and then we get, if you notice here, this is the path to that JavaScript file. And then we're able to make a call to it on the module itself. So we can, right here, we can invoke the show prompt or show alert. That's what came up in the browser and had the latitude and longitude right there. Or also we could call the use current geolocation async. These were all corresponding to methods that were over in my JavaScript file. So if you need that, it's there. I'm telling you, Blazor it's pretty incredible how many bases they covered. So how do I determine the path forward? If you're new to Blazor, or I do JavaScript or I do Blazor, remember I talked about team strengths. What's your DNA? Are you a .NET shop? Do you have a lot of .NET code? There's no need to rush and like modernize and move over to Blazor if you have a working application. But if it's legacy, like you're in ASP.NET MVC or something like that, and you're trying to figure out, Blazor's probably a great candidate. It is definitely fully capable, enterprise ready. All the things that I showed you today, there's nothing on that end that should be any deterrent from getting into there. You can always create a little POC, feel it out. If you're a decision maker, if you're an architect, or if you're a contributor, use these data points and information to show, which direction. And then once you're in Blazor, again, the buffet, you have a lot of decisions to make. Let the requirements drive it. If you have 2 users, and even if it's a mission critical app and 2 users, maybe you're just going to do server interactive. Call it a day, you don't need both, and just keep it simple. But maybe you've got thousands of concurrent users. Maybe you need a mobile presence and you want to consider a PWA, which Blazor can do too. There's a lot of different options there. But remember, at the end of the day, some of that stuff's like day one, you're going to be doing components. You're going to be building the application. few useful links. That's the demo code that we did today. And of course, you want to get ground up or learn the syntax, understand WebAssembly a little bit more as an independent technology and compiling. There are other languages that compile to WebAssembly and can run in the browser. Early on, it was like C++ and Rust and things like that. But we like it because we can use C# and .NET. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day here at Live 360 and the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.